Hi, everyone. Welcome to this amazing launch and event for How to End Family Policing. And I want, before we get started, to just give a thank you to the amazing Haymarket team. If you cannot see me, I am a light-skinned brown woman with gray hair. I'm wearing black and what color? Black and brown glasses, red lipstick, and a maroon shirt. And I'm here with my two colleagues, Andrea Ritchie and Dorothy Roberts. And we want to thank this amazing team, our care team that's helped us be here today, and all the labor that made this event possible. And everyone who's able to come today, who continues to build the world that we dream of, the freedom that we need, even in deteriorating conditions. We're honored by the invitation to learn and build together. We have a special thanks to our co-authors who are here in audience. They were in Chicago presenting, Erica Miners, Shannon Perez Darby, and Charity Tolliver. This really was a group effort, an effort that we did collectively, and a special thank you to all the contributors in this book. I have to say, this book is filled with so much genius and so many contributors. And they are doing the daily work of building freedom and safety for families. So before we get started, I just want to talk about why this book and why now. When Erica first approached us and said we should write a book, it was on the heels of a conversation after Beyond the Bars where myself, Charity, Shannon, Erica, Jasmine, Wally, Isla, Van, we had had a long conversation around mandated reporting. We turned it into a zine. You can find it at Movement for Family Power. And Erica said, there needs to be more books. And I told her, no, there doesn't need to be any more books. And she was right and I was wrong. What she said is that we need more conversations around this system of harm that we grew up calling the child welfare system or the foster care system, but that families, organizers, scholars, and activists have told us that is the family policing system. That we needed this book to talk about the moment that we're in right now, to not only be outraged, but to fuel our outrage into action. We needed to tell the stories of the work on the ground. We needed to tell the stories and listen to the organizers, the mamas, the activists who've been doing this work every day, resisting and fighting. Not because everyone's resistance is the same, but precisely because everyone's resistance is different, but it's resistance nonetheless. And it's resistance that joins us together and collects all of our visions into freedom and safety. For me, it was a selfish endeavor. It gave me the opportunity to listen to all the work that's been happening, to think about what has actually changed over time and what fight still continues. We have a moment of rising fascism, of genocide, of rising repression. And it's time in this moment right now to think about how do we just continue to motivate ourselves into action, collect our legacy and harvest our stories of resistance, and build the liberation that we all deserve. A special thank you to our young people in our lives that gave us the space and opportunity, whether they will say that to their therapist later on, I'm not sure, but gave us the space and opportunity to write these books, to share these memories. And I'm really happy to have Andrea Ritchie here today, who is one of the first people who said to me, hey, can you talk about this in a book? And she has an incredible book that if people don't have, Invisible No More Police Violence Against Black Women and Women of Color, people should pick that book up too. And she's a scholar and activist. Professor Dorothy Roberts, who has made me say that I have to call her Dorothy, but I'm not sure how consistent I will be with that today, who is just about everything to everyone. And she is a scholar, an activist. She is a longtime listener of the stories of women who have been experiencing this system of oppression. And she's been such an incredible mentor to all of us. I remember her just taking every single call, letting me film her on my iPad for our first convening we had with the National Council of Formerly Incarcerated Women and Girls, when me and Lisa Sangoy founded Movement for Family Power. And it's with incredible gratitude that we really wanted to start this conversation today about this book with you, Professor Roberts, who I will call Dorothy, You have been writing about the child, quote unquote, welfare system for decades. We feel like this book follows in your footsteps. Can you talk about why you felt the urgency to talk about the system in your early books like Shattered Bonds? What shifts in the discourse you may have seen since bringing this information to our attention? And I think we lost your sound. I know. I also promised to everyone who's listening that if we lost Professor Robert's sound, I would grace you all with an interpretive dance or just deflect. And so I'll do that. And so while she's getting her sound back together, can we hear you one more time? I think you just have to close your tab and restart. I am going to talk a little bit to Andrea while you close your tab and we come back on. Andrea, what did you learn from Shattered Bonds? How did that impact the way you think about the work?
I mean, I learned so much from Shattered Bonds. In fact, I think the chapter on family policing that is in Invisible No More that you referenced is basically a cut and paste from the passages of Shattered Bonds that shaped my understanding of family policing, with wisdom from you and others who are editors and contributors to this book thrown in. And I really have learned so much from that. But what I want to say about Dr. Roberts' work, which has been really eye-opening, is that I started reading Professor Roberts around policing of Black and brown youth in Chicago, right? The law review article that she wrote about policing Black and brown youth in Chicago. And what has been really important to me about her work is how she went from there to family policing seamlessly. And also that she went to abolition of the family policing system before so many of us. And I think that for a law professor who is, in an institution that is about sort of, studying systems, playing around the edges of them, talking about how they might be unjustly applied at some times, or they might be, but the systems themselves are recuperable and can be fair and objective. It was a real risk, frankly, to kind of come out there and be like, this system should be abolished from the position that she was in. And I just think that has been so inspiring and pushed so many of us to move beyond sort of only thinking about police and prison abolition, or only immigration policing and prison abolition, or ICE abolition and prison and policing abolition, to really think about abolition of systems that are premised on the notion of protection and care, when they are in fact systems of policing in similar and different forms to the kinds of policing that she was first writing about as constitutional violations of the rights of Black and brown youth in Chicago. So that's my introduction to what I learned from Shattered Bonds and the life trajectory and scholarship trajectory of Professor Dr. Dorothy Roberts.
So you missed very little, Dorothy. We were just singing your praises while you were getting your sound back. Can we see if we can hear you this time?
Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can.
Yeah. I shifted from my iPhone microphone. I went into settings and shifted to my Mac microphone. So I don't know how it started with iPhone microphone, and so let me repeat what I was going to say, or what I said. No one could hear me. I'm just so grateful to be part of this conversation. Thank you, Erin, for the introduction. Thank you, Andrea, for whatever you said. I'm sure it was wonderful, and I'm so honored to be collaborating with you most again, as we have over the years. I recall your I'm getting some interference there. All right.
We can still hear you, though.
You can hear me? Okay. I'm hearing on my end an echo of what I'm saying, but if you can't hear it, it's okay.
I can hear it right now.
Okay.
Yeah.
Sorry about all this.
We made a book about doing, and this is what doing looks like sometimes. Doing looks a little messy, and the message will still get crossed.
There we go. So,
So what has changed, and what did you, when you started looking at the
Okay.
system, and what
Okay.
made you write Shattered?
So I first encountered the family policing system when I was working on my book, Killing the Black Body, which was published in 1997. And it's a book about the multiple ways that Black women childbearing is punished and regulated. It came out of my investigations and opposition to the prosecutions of Black women for being pregnant and using drugs. And then I started to think about all the other ways that Black women's childbearing was degraded and devalued, and the ways Black women fought back against that. But I didn't include in that book the taking of Black women's children. And as I was doing this research on the prosecutions, I discovered that many, many more Black women were having their newborns taken from them at birth, which I thought was horrendous. I was shocked that there were thousands of Black women, because of a single positive drug test, were having their babies taken from them, which you don't even need scientific research or a pediatrician to tell you it's bad to take someone's baby away from them at birth. It's bad for the baby. So the idea that this was to protect babies was absurd to me. And then I wanted to find out, how can the government do this? And I discovered that there's a whole system, which I knew existed, but I probably knew the same myths everybody else, unless they've experienced this system, thought, which is it comes in extreme cases of abuse where there's no other way to support the family and children are being rescued, in rare instances. Well, I found out that's absolutely not true. And I was living in Chicago at the time, and I was sitting in court in Chicago, and all I saw literally were Black mothers pleading to get their children back. And I began to meet with Black mothers in Chicago. I met with a group that used to meet regularly in the basement of a church in Englewood and just support each other, try what they could to try to resist. But it was very hard, because anyone who knows the system knows that the worst thing you can do as a parent in the system is complain about how they're treating your children or try to fight back, because then you're deemed to be rebellious, non-compliant. You don't understand how terrible a parent you are, because the way that this system approaches struggling families is to blame the parents for having some pathology or cognitive deficit, and then the solution isn't to support the family, it's to force the parents and the children into therapy and parent training classes and other kinds of ridiculous mandates that they have to fulfill to either keep their children or get their children back. And so these mothers were trying as best they could, but it was very hard, and there was very little support for them. The reason I wrote Shattered Bonds is because I couldn't find a single book since the 1970s that even criticized this system, and especially that highlighted how racist it was. It was just shocking to me that you could have a system that so obviously was targeting Black families and punishing people for poverty and disability, and mostly punishing mothers. So there was also a sexist, gendered aspect to it, misogynistic aspect to it, punishing people for not being able to take the best possible care of their children in a society that was working against their ability to care for their children, a society that was harming their children, and they're being blamed for it. And I didn't see any books on this topic. I didn't see any civil rights organizations putting this at the top of their agenda, even mentioning it. I didn't see reproductive rights organizations putting this on their agenda. And it was just astounding to me. And I felt I had to write a book about it. And part of your question was, how have things changed? So, as I just mentioned, when I started working on this, there were very few people speaking out against this system and calling it what it was, and is a system of oppression against the most marginalized people in the country that harms children and their families, does not support them or provide welfare or care to them. And uh, I, so that was if you looked at the news media, the only time you ever heard about this system was when there was a death in the family, a death of a child in the home. Very rare, but that was picked up in the headlines. And then the answer was, well, take more children away. We're not taking enough children away. The most prominent legal voice in the country at the time was a professor at Harvard Law School named Elizabeth Bartholet, who wrote a book called Nobody's Children and advocated taking more Black children, specifically, explicitly Black children away. She supported transracial adoption of these children. And as a Harvard professor, she got a lot of attention. And that's what you heard. All the social science research and the child welfare researchers were busy trying to explain away race. They were using fancy, false statistical equations to try to make it seem like, oh, this has nothing to do with race. And then there were others who were saying, well, Black children need these so-called services, and that's why. So that was the state of things back then. That book was published in 2001. Today, we have Black mothers at the forefront of abolitionist organizing. We see that abolition is the only answer to the harms that the system is inflicting on children, and also the only answer to truly supporting families and keeping children safe. Even though I think, and we'll talk about this more, I'm sure, in this hour, but even though we still have a hard way to go, there's still, the myths are still out there, and there's a lot of even backlash. Well, there's now backlash against us, which is one thing that shows that you're making a difference when there's a campaign against you. But so there are now people writing about people stating that abolition is not the answer. I'm sure all of us have been faced either in prison abolition or abolition of family policing with people who say, oh, I understand what you're saying, but please don't use the word abolition. So that's still going on. But, we have organizations that are explicitly abolitionist. Black mothers no longer have to meet in church basements for fear that their children, no one will listen to them, and their actions might keep their children in the foster system. They have supporters and allies, people who take their leadership, and that has dramatically changed. I'll also say personally, when I wrote Shattered Bonds, even though if you read the very preface, I say we should abolish the system, but I then said, and replace it with another system. And I didn't know that much about abolition at the time. I felt it in my heart, but I hadn't studied the principles. I hadn't collaborated with abolitionists. I hadn't read the works of abolitionists. And so I spent almost 20 years in reform efforts to try to fix this system. And I worked with foundations. I worked as an expert for 9 years in Washington State, coming out of a class action lawsuit that found that the state was violating the constitutional rights of children in foster care. I tried to train social workers. I did all that kind of stuff, and so I know very well from personal experience that reform does not work, and that's what led me to write my book Torn Apart. That takes a very strong and clear stand for abolition as the only way, again, not only to end the harms that this system inflicts, but also to imagine and create the approach that we need to truly keep children safe and support families.
I really appreciate that. And it really situates us really nicely into kind of our next question, which is about these dominant narratives. And I think I also always love when you remind everyone that you've seen, witnessed, tried reform for a very long time, and it just does not work. And when I think about the book that we wrote, How to End Family Policing, we really try to situate it in this recent wave of abolition movement that really is about, I think most activists here are, most of them are 2018 forward in the kind of the primary parts of their activism, with some exceptions with Margaret Prescott, who's, elder who's been there along the way in every single piece of the movement, and also Reverend Annie Chambers, and one of the pieces that we write, which is I'm not an organizer, I just organize. But we couldn't capture the entire movement, right? And we left many gaps about the whole, and that we hope that people will actually find when they're reading it. It's not a gotcha book. We hope you find a gap and we hope you fill it. We hope you research your own work. You write your own zines, that you write your own songs, your own plays about the things that are missing. But it does aim to interrupt some of the dominant narratives that are capturing hearts and minds at this moment, especially in this moment of retrenchment. In your all's opinion, I'm going to start with you, Andrea. What are some of the myths or dominant narratives that one has to unlearn to see family policing as a site of carceral control?
I mean, one is the myth that the family policing system is different from any other system of policing. And so what you missed, Dorothy, was me talking about first encountering your work around policing of Black and brown youth in Chicago and the constitutional violations of stops and gang policing, et cetera. And I see a very continuous thread between that work and Torn Apart. But I don't think most people do. So I think most people think that it's not a system of policing of parenting in the way that you have so clearly shown, or policing of families in service of existing structural relations of power in the ways that you've so clearly shown. And then because it's a civil system, I think conversely, people think that people have the same rights as they do in the criminal system, even though they don't think of it as the same. So I think that's another myth. Like, you don't have the right to counsel. You don't have the right to notice. You don't have the right to anything. You can just literally have someone come in your house and kidnap your child. And and it's completely rationalized and legitimized by the system. And so many instances of police violence that I documented in the family policing chapter of Invisible No More happened in that exact instance, in which someone literally came into a mother's house to kidnap her child, and she reacted as any mother would, saying, I don't even, especially if I don't know that you're the police, that's definitely not going to happen. And so many women experienced physical and sometimes fatal violence around that. And so it's literally the same, right? The same outcomes, the same process, but with even fewer protections of the very limited protections. So I think that's one myth that people don't understand. I think the other myth is the obvious one, right? Which is that it offers any kind of safety or protection. And I really appreciate what you were saying about the harm of family separation, right? That in of itself is a harm. So you're adding harm to any harm that's already happening. You're adding harm, because even when the people who are experiencing significant amounts of violence, whether it's in the context of domestic violence or family violence, they don't want to end the relationship. They want the violence to stop. And one, you're adding on violence by ending the relationship, and secondly, you're putting people in a system where more violence is likely to occur than less, and that is very similar to the prison industrial complex, but people don't see that. I think people really hold on to this system as the one that is actually helping somehow, even though it's the exact same as the other systems. And so I feel like that's a really important myth. And I think the notion that it's evenly applied, even though the statistics and the case that you make so powerfully in Shattered Bonds and Torn Apart, that it is not evenly applied and that it operates just like the criminal punishment system in terms of the racial disparities, is not one that people understand. And I think we can, I mean, you talk about so many examples of it, right? That you were looking out your window on the south side of Chicago, seeing white kids playing outside on their own. Nothing was happening to them. Black children outside for 5 minutes while their grandmother's watching from the stoop, and it's a CPS case, right? And I think people don't understand like the depth to which that is true. And I can say that from my own experience. I mean, I called for help and didn't get protection as a child. And I know that it was because I was calling for help on my white father, who was able to very quickly dispel that whole situation. And if I had called for help on my black mother, I would have been out of that house, and there would have been no, it would have been a very different thing. And I think also many of us who were raised in either economic or racial privilege or other forms of privilege can talk about situations where I was babysitting newborns at the age of 11. I had no business babysitting newborns at the age of 11, but no one was coming for me. But mothers go to prison and have their families taken from them because they left the 13-year-old in charge of the 10-year-old while they went for a job interview to try and feed and provide for those families. And those kinds of disparities are just not ones that people process on a daily basis. Like the kinds of danger that wealthy parents put their children in. I have been in situations on boats that were so dangerous. Not one person was coming to check on whether I was safe in our family, vacation, but people are engaged in much less risky activities, and their children are being ripped from them and they're being punished. So I think we really have to look at like the nitty-gritty of the fact that this system, just like every other carceral system, is not about harm. It is not about protection. It is not about safety. It is about policing parents and families, and particularly, as you've so compellingly shown, and I agree with you, there was nothing else out there. So the other thing I said when you were adjusting your sound was that the chapter on family policing and Invisible No More is basically cut and paste of Shattered Bonds with permission, with contributions from other folks in the book, in this How to End Family Policing book, because there was nothing else out there. And it was so stark and so compelling and so important. And I think also the policing of Indigenous families and parents, again, is something that people were not understanding in the same way, and has only more recently come to light as part of a long legacy of colonialization in this country, in the same way that family policing is part of a long legacy of chattel slavery and its afterlives. And you make that case so compellingly about, and the last thing I'll say is that the main myth is that this is actually about children. And I think that is something you make such a compelling case for in Shattered Bonds, where you're like, you're policing Black moms for having kids and for not having kids and for raising them and not like, no matter what a Black woman does, she's going to get policed around, or a Black parent does, is going to get policed around their parenting, because it's about reinforcing those systems. And I think that myth is the one that we really most have to break. Among all of those. So they all need to be broken. But the notion that it's actually about the children at all is the one that I think is the one that hooks most people, even who are prison abolitionists or police abolitionists or carceral abolitionists. The notion that it's about protecting vulnerable children is the hardest thing for people to let go of. And we have to help people understand that it does no such thing under 99.99% of circumstances.
Mm-hmm.
And I think about those narratives, especially when I think about Charity Tolliver's piece in How to End Family Policing about what about child sexual abuse, right? That's everyone's primary go-to. They say, well, we have to keep this system. And I think, Dorothy, you talked about earlier, people are rejecting this notion of abolition, but because they are worried about the what about, right? What about the children? What about sexual abuse, right? And I think what Charity writes in the piece that they put into the book is that this isn't actually meeting that particular need. This idea that this particular system, the family policing system, what we grew up calling the child welfare system, the fact that we believe that it can end sexual assault and sexual abuse, even though it is a system that requires domination, patriarchy, and reinforces the nuclear family, is not actually going to serve children, people, or in sexual violence.
Mm-hmm.
I always tell people that if I did have the answer to how to end sexual violence and it was within the family policing system, you would see me as the strongest advocate for it. There's nothing that I would rather do than end gender-based violence and sexual violence and rape and assault. I would be out here every day on the streets in the way that I am now, championing the end of this particular system.
Mm-hmm.
And it kind of brings me to this next question that I want to pose to you, Dorothy, about that Corey Best offers in this book. So Corey is a fantastic advocate, activist, scholar, thoughtful person, friend, and a father who's experienced the system. And you can learn more about his work at Mining for Gold. And in his piece on how to end family policing, he offers us an important framework to question the family policing system in totality. He asks us to always ask the question, who is safe and who is protected? In his piece, he talks about the impact of the family policing system in his own life and his own pathways towards radicalization. So to do my best conjuring of Corey, I want to ask you, Dorothy, who does the family policing system protect? I think we talk a lot about who it doesn't protect, but who is it who or what is it keeping safe?
Yeah. Well, first I want to say that, Andrea, you really hit those myths on the head. They're all of them are so true, and why this struggle for abolition is so challenging, but also why it's so necessary, because it's the honest truth, and these myths keep this oppressive system intact, persuading people to believe what is not true. And that persuasion, as Corey points out, yes, it is protecting certain people. Now, one way of looking at it is it's protecting the families of wealthier white people, because people have to understand this system was not designed for them at all. It's not just that, well, it's ignoring them. It wasn't even designed for them. It's a system that was designed, and Andrea mentioned the whole history of it. You could look at the history of it, and including the way it's funded, connected to, what we might call welfare. It's not really welfare anymore, but anyway, but that funding stream, federal funding stream for impoverished families, the biases in the reporting. I would add another myth is that mandated reporting helps anybody. That should be abolished too. Who gets reported, who gets called on. Andrea gave lots of great examples that, we absolutely know, everybody knows this. Everybody knows that if a wealthy white woman is using drugs or drinking during pregnancy, her doctor's not going to call the child welfare hotline to come take her baby from her. Everybody knows if the white businessman, even if he is sexually abusing the children, or his friend is, just read the latest memoirs by wealthy white women. Many of them contain stories about sexual abuse in the family that was just ignored because it benefited the family. So you could say that it's and studies bear this out also. It's just so well documented. So you could say it's protecting not the children, obviously. It's protecting the interests of mainly white men to continue control of their families. But I would say it's even deeper than that. What it's really protecting is the idea that this nation cares about the safety of children, and the reason why children aren't safe is because of their pathological parents, their deficient parents. Therefore, why believe that? Because then you don't need radical social change. If you don't need to end child poverty, because child poverty isn't and the structural forces that create it, those aren't the problem. The problem is the cognitive deficits of impoverished parents who don't know how to care for their children. And to me, that's really what is being protected. It's the capitalist, racist, white supremacist, patriarchal, ableist system that is what is the regime in our nation, as you mentioned in your introduction, Erin, is being even more brutally upheld today. And this is also why it's so essential to see the connections, as Andrea was explaining, between the carceral system and the civil so-called child protection family policing system. They both uphold the same regime in the same very similar ways, because the point of the carceral system, the criminal carceral system, is to say, well, we're dealing with unmet human needs by caging people. And somehow people believe it. But guess what? They believe even more. Even when I say that, that sounds absurd. So absurd. Why would you even believe it? But many people do. But it doesn't seem so absurd to say we're meeting children's needs by punishing, by rescuing them from harmful parents. That's the myth that people believe. And again, who does that protect? It protects the most elite interests of people who don't want to actually meet the needs of children, because to do that, you would have to radically change this society. You would have to eradicate child poverty. You would have to end the prison system, because that's also harming children. You would have to have economic supports for everybody. You would have to figure out, how do we ensure that every child has decent housing and food and clothing and education and healthcare? That's what you would have to do to keep children safe. So who benefits by convincing people that you don't have to do that? All you have to do is go out and kidnap the children of pathological parents. Well, who benefits? The people who don't want to change our society to ensure that there's housing for everybody. The people who don't want to change our society to ensure that everyone has nutritious food that they need. They don't want to change society to ensure that everyone has the education they need. They don't want to change society to ensure that everyone has the health care they need. That's fundamentally what this system props up. That's why it's so incredible that people don't see how powerful this system is. It's powerful on the level that someone could come into your house and kidnap your children because they think you don't have enough food in the refrigerator. Or they literally think this is a real thing. You have a messy home. That's a literal thing. You have a messy home. So either you have too much in your home, there's a mess, or you don't have too little in your home. All right, or whatever bogus reason they want to come in, they can literally do that. Some kid who has no experience in your community, who's as biased as you want to be can come in and do that. So there's that power. And then I think you asked the question, why give people that power? Because it upholds a system that doesn't really protect children, but protects the interests of the most elite in this nation. And I tell you, it's incredible how they have fooled people into thinking that they have some interest in, protecting this elite. And again, the situation we're in right now in this country, I mean, hopefully you think every day I think, okay, come on now, you can't be fooled anymore. Look what's going right. Like you cannot be fooled anymore. It's so blatant. But it's powerful. It's powerful. These ideologies, these ways of thinking are very powerful. And that's ultimately what we have to challenge and persuade on.
And I really appreciate that, because I often think about the fact that if I were speaking to people who are against abolition or who really wanted to preserve the system of family policing, everyone would start off by saying, we want to make sure children are safe. We want, everyone would say that.
Mhm.
Maybe everyone wouldn't say the next sentence, we want to make sure families are safe,
Yeah.
but they would at least start there. But then I also see those same people not resisting when there are calls made on trans children,
Yeah.
not resisting when the system separates families for enormous amounts of time without any type of process,
Yeah.
without any type of way to challenge it. And
Yeah.
I see those same people saying it's too much, too expensive, not their job, not something that's important to them to provide housing for families, right? That's something that we know will stabilize families and reduce maltreatment. I
Yeah.
see those very same oppositionists resisting um, increases to child for cash subsidies for families. Literally, these same people who are in opposition, but in the very first question say, yes, I want to protect children, say, but I don't think cash should go to families who need support and help. And I think that's very revealing.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that lets us know who is actually safe and who is actually protected. You can't just say, I think children should be protected, but then the next thing that you write or publish or read an op-ed on is why you're against universal basic income
Yeah.
for children
Mhm.
and families,
Mhm.
and then say that that makes sense. It doesn't make sense. What is protected here is racial capitalism.
Yeah.
What is protected is a caste system that permits us to see certain people with darker skin as not fit, as not acceptable, and are the type of people that don't get all the rights of people because those people don't see us as people.
Mm-hmm.
They can't say that, but they can say, we love the child welfare system and that's saving children.
Mm.
Now, I want to go to Dorothy. In the book, we excerpt, I think this part of our lives, we just take what you get and you've shown us and we just republish it over and over. We excerpt this piece in How to End Family Policing about the community dimension of the family policing system.
Mm-hmm.
I think it was really important. Well, I don't think, I was an editor of the book. I know it was important to me to include this piece because I think many people see themselves as outside the impact of the family policing system. And you have been talking about this for a long time. And so in the book, How to End Family Policing, we revisit some of your earlier scholarship that discusses the community dimension of the family policing system. Can you, to the people who are new to this book, maybe haven't picked it up or maybe haven't Googled your scholarship, can you really help people understand what it means to have this community dimension of the family policing system and why there's an urgent need to not place yourself outside of the horrible impact of the system?
Mm-hmm. Well, one point I wanted to make, and I'm not sure if this directly answers your question, but it is part of the community dimension of the child welfare system, is how this system and I should say family policing. So I wrote that so long ago, the word family policing wasn't even in the ether yet. But anyway, um, community dimension. One part I wanted to highlight was how the family policing system impacts entire Black communities. And that was, I was kind of pushing back against the way a lot of child welfare researchers use statistics to, on a very individualized basis. So they're counting up, how many Black children have been taken from their homes, how many Black children have been subjected to child welfare investigations. And somehow, even though those numbers are astounding by themselves, they say, well, but they needed it. So they try to erase the racism in it. But what they don't take into account is how this system affects entire communities, not just the children who have experienced the investigation, even though a recent study found that half of Black children in America will suffer a child welfare investigation before they reach age 18. That's a lot. But a whole lot more are still affected by it because they know that their cousins got investigated or even taken. They know that their neighbor did. They know their classmate did. In some Black neighborhoods in Chicago, where most child welfare agency involvement takes place, and this is true for every big city, the predominantly white neighborhoods, they've never heard of this system other than what they read in the papers. Then you, in a Black neighborhood in America, any Black neighborhood in America, I would venture to say virtually everybody has heard of it, including the little children. So it affects your relationship to the state. If you know that any moment somebody can come into your house and take your children away, take you away, even if you haven't experienced it. And I was trying to show, I wrote another piece about the racial geography of child welfare, where I did a little study in Woodlawn in Chicago, where I interviewed Black mothers, and they all knew about this. They all knew what it did. They all thought that it was a system comes in and takes people's children away. So it affected, and they all could report on how it affected their relationships with their neighbors in bad ways, in harmful ways. So that's something I wanted to draw out of it in this piece. But also related to what I was just talking about before, the way in which the system affects everybody because it upholds policies that affect all of us. And it gets many people to ignore the harms of those policies because they're putting the blame and the focus on whom they've been convinced are bad parents, and that's an effective way of keeping children safe. And then another aspect of the community dimension is that community-based organizing, community-based resources and mutual aid are an important component, essential component of abolition. I happen to believe, I don't know if we want to get into this debate now, but I happen to believe that we should also demand from the state massive amounts of resources for families. So I know there are some abolitionists that believe we should not engage with the state at all. I don't believe in cooperating with the child welfare system. I don't think we should do that. But I personally believe that in order to keep children safe and ensure their welfare, we need a dramatic shift in the way in which resources are allocated that our taxpayer money is going to. And so, but in addition, I also think, and I don't want to make this seem like a side thing, I think it's equally important to have community-based approaches and resources and mutual aid for families. Uh, for we Joyce McMillan talks about mandated supporting rather than mandated reporting. All those reporters in the community that are calling CPS when they see a child in need, uh, they should be part of hubs within communities to support families. Would just be ludicrous to say, I'm a social service program, and what I'm going to do when I see a family that needs housing is call CPS to take the children away. I'm a doctor, I'm a pediatrician who is trained to care for children. And when I see a child who needs food, I'm going to call CPS to take the child away. Like, it's so absurd. Or I'm going to call a caseworker who hasn't a clue about how to support this family, and even if they had the clue, they don't have the resources at their disposal. I'm going to call them to come in.
And I actually think
yeah.
Oh,
no, go on. I'm done. Go on.
It's interesting to say Shannon Perez Darby writes in her piece, Who Do You Tell, about this experience working with a young person who wanted a report and how Shannon actually worked through that. And then Leah and Eleni talk about a network that they do now, which is Mandated Reporters Against Mandated Reporters, right? Mm-hmm. And it's interesting because they've been working within community. And in Shannon's piece in particular, she talks about how all the things that young person wanted from the report never materialized.
Yeah.
And I think it's a lot easier for people to think, oh, if I'm a doctor and someone needs food, I'll just get food, right? But there is harm that happens. There's abuse that happens. And yet this system repeatedly, and what we try to show through like real life examples, is also it's outing people's immigration status. It's creating a lot of publicity towards things that people want privacy without any agency for young people. The system does not create agency for young people at all. It comes in. That's exactly what a mandated reporter does. Like, it comes in and makes decisions for the family and creates multiple layers of decision makers for the child, which include judges and caseworkers and multiple levels of caseworkers. Mm-hmm. When I think of the community dimension, maybe this is why I'm probably one people like downloads this article all the time, Dorothy, is because I think of myself as a Black mother and how I just really spent the first 7 years of my children's lives like waiting for them to turn 7. Why? Because in New York City, that's when they start listening to children and directly advocate for them. And I was like, well, at least they're 7 years old. They're going to have to say what my kids want, right? And, I was very fortunate to not have CPS called on me, but I lived in the South Bronx at the time, and now I live in East Baltimore. And so many of my decisions were about, well, how do you, if something happens to you, what are safe people you can talk to? And talking to my 4-year-olds and 5-year-old children about how they can engage with people that are supposed to be their teachers, right? How they can talk to them, and not to talk to them because I wanted them to fear their own bodily safety, because I wanted them to also have agency and understand what are the things that these people can and cannot do. Mm-hmm. And the other point that you raise is mandated reporting. I also think when we think about the community dimension, and I hope people that are listening to this, who are teachers, who are school social workers, who are all of these now reporters, really understand that they are the patrol unit of this policing system. Mm-hmm. We have the ability to identify the criminal police patrol unit out on the street. Those are the people who come into regular contact with people, and they get close to people's bodies. They stop and frisk them. They assault them. They arrest them, right? The family police system also has a patrol unit. Yeah. And they are what we call social services providers and our helping system, right? And what an awful world to live in, where in many, many, many communities, anyone who is in your quote unquote care or service network is also within the patrol network for CPS. Yeah. That is an outstanding place to live in society. And it's an outstanding way to adjust yourself to live. Yeah. So,
Yeah.
you started to talk about abolition of the state, and we won't get so heavy into that today, but I think it's an interesting question as we go and talk a little bit about Jaboa Lake's article. And we're going to end a little early because you know what? We're not trying to spend hours and hours, because you're going to read the book instead. But I did want to talk about Jaboa Lake's article, which is Prevention, Reparations, and Reunification. Jaboa talks about their own experience, again, in the family policing system. And the actions that Jaboa asks us to take are ones of thinking about reparations. Jaboa argues that the family policing system's tools of removal, incarceration, rehoming, adoption, and court treatment services in their lives were not tools of safety. They discuss how the system of family separation was necessary to maintain the prison to foster care pipeline, which provides billions of dollars to private companies and maintains social control of communities of color. And part of their action is they say there can be no reparations framework without us including family policing inside that framework. And so I guess I want to turn to you, Andrea, is first, because I know that you wrote about reparations and movement for Black lives, and you talk about it often. I've learned a lot from you. Why is reparations an important framework when we're thinking about addressing the harm of the family policing system? And what can we do within our movements to ensure that this particular system and the analysis is incorporated in our fights for reparations? I think we lost your sound, Andrea.
I did it.
Oh,
I was trying to keep you all from hearing the endless construction outside my house. But I think the main reason, so one of many reasons, is that reparations requires a cataloging of the harm. And I think a cataloging of the harm, particularly from the perspective of people harmed, would bust a lot of the myths that we were talking about, right? Like, it would be like, wait a minute, if you hear from people that they were, the story that Shannon told, what they wanted from the system, they didn't get, that the young people we thought we were protecting were harmed more in multiple ways. The families were harmed, the communities were harmed, and we take stock of the harm versus any kind of benefit, we will bust a lot of the myths about the system. So I think that's the first thing about reparations. So there has to be a cataloging and an acknowledgement of the harm in a comprehensive way. The second thing about reparations is that many people forget about this part. Sure, there's compensation. Sure, there's healing and restitution and restoration of people to the extent possible to the position they would have been in without the harm. And so that would bring some family repair. That would bring some healing resources to communities that have been harmed. That would bring, the kinds of repair and investment that Dorothy was talking about in terms of putting resources back into communities. And I do want to say about this question of the state, I think that there's agreement among abolitionists that our collective resources should be invested in the well-being of our communities and particularly of children. There's a question of how we do that without policing, and whether we can do that without policing through a state formation or through other kinds of ways of organizing ourselves as society. But the key is how we use our resources, how we distribute them, and how we do that without policing people. And we are very capable of policing people ourselves without the state. And I think the child welfare system and the ways in which people deploy it against each other or police each other inside of families is a really clear indication of the fact that we don't need a state to engage in policing sometimes, although it certainly serves the interests of the state to engage in policing. So, but reparations would require us to think about how to invest and distribute our collective resources without policing. The other thing that is really important is that reparations requires non-repetition of the harm. And that is also a critical part about reparations, because it would require us to think about what would actually keep children safe, right? And this question of prevention. And I think much like in, the prison and policing and other situations where people are trying to address harm, as Rachel Hertzing, Black feminist abolitionist who taught me so much of what I know, says, like, it's framed as an on or off situation. It's either, you have this harmful system or you have harm. And those are the only two options. And in fact, what non-repetition would require us to understand is that there are actually alternatives. That is a myth that if we don't have the child welfare system, then we're just abandoning people to harm. In the same way that there's a myth that if we don't have the prison industrial complex, we're abandoning survivors to harm. And as Mariam Kaba and I write in No More Police, abolition is a survivor-led movement, including the movement for abolition of the family policing system. I just told you situations where it didn't work for me or people around me who I knew. That's why I want something more and better for every child who has experienced harm and not this. And so reparations would require us to assess what non-repetition really meant and looked like. So I think those are the reasons it's an important framework. I think another one is this question of community engagement. I think reparations requires us to think about how, as a society, we are responsible for the conditions that led to the harm. Mm-hmm. And as a society, how we need to repair those and build a world differently. And I think that policing, whether it's family policing or any kind of policing, we have been trained to delegate responsibility to someone that we call, right? A state actor who's going to come with a limited set of tools and a lot of violence. Instead of saying, how can I help? And the things that have ended violence in my life have not been the state. They have been people saying, here's a safe place to come live. Here's a safe place to come stay. I'm a preacher in your church. I'm going to go talk to your family. Mm-hmm. I'm going to intervene when I see violence. I'm going to encourage you to go to college so you can get away from home, like whatever, right? Or come to church all weekend so that we can get you out of your house, whatever it is. And I think those kinds of things and a sense of collective responsibility and community are what actually prevents the worst forms of child sexual violence or of violence against children, is the notion that people are there, are looking, are invested, and they care, rather than the notion that you just call somebody who's going to come and take care of it, which encourages people to hide things. Yeah. It encourages people to not ask for help. It encourages people not to admit that they're struggling, that, you know, I'm a single parent and I haven't slept in 3 weeks and I might just shake this child if I don't get a nap. You know, can someone help me? You know, and you're not allowed to do that because someone's going to drop a dime on you. Yeah. But if we are collectively responsible in the ways that, you know, if I see my neighbor struggling, I'll be like, just go take a shower. I'll sit with your baby for, you know, however you need or whatever. That's how we prevent, that's how we understand our collective responsibility for everyone's well-being and safety. And that's how we get to that through a reparative framework, a reparations framework, rather than trying to tweak a system that is set up to do what we've been talking about doing.
And I think Jaboa talks about in their article that is true prevention, right? When we talk about we need prevention, we really need to be thinking about what does reparations require us to do? What does repair require us to do? Not what is a prevention service plan that allows us to move funding into a particular nonprofit. We really want to move past that. I wouldn't even call it a Band-Aid. We need to move past that framework altogether when we're thinking about the concept of prevention. I do want to quickly address 2 of the questions in the chat. We're not going to get to all of them, but one question talks about the dialogue around family abolitionism. And I do want to say that in the book, Ignacio Rivera writes about abolishing the family. And I think this is an important concept, and it really ties really well to that question around who is safe and who is protected. I think we could say what is safe and what is protected. I often think that this concept of family is way broader than what the family policing system allows us to exist in. Mm-hmm. We know that queer families, trans families, that people have been living in really dynamic community structures, families, for long periods of time, often in resistance and always in care. Mm-hmm. And I want to talk to you or ask either one of you to just opine or talk a little bit about the way the family policing system actually defines, reifies, and protects the nuclear family and maybe stifles our imagination for community care. So I'm going to give that to you, Dorothy, okay? Because you were asked in this.
Okay. I think that's absolutely true. So I've also encountered people who say, well, you want to abolish the family policing system, but does that mean you want to uphold traditional notions of the family? And I said, no, it's the opposite. The family policing system punishes people for not being in traditional, or its conception of what a family should look like, whether we're talking about the racial makeup of the family, or the gendered makeup of the family, or the economic makeup of the family. It goes after marginalized families, and that is families that don't meet a particular norm of white, nuclear, husband-led, um, uh, uh, heterosexual, all of this ableist. Any departure from that is an invitation for the family police to come in and punish that family. So to me, and you kind of said this, Erin, to me, it is a way of forcing people into a particular notion of family, or if they can't be forced into it, punishing them for it. So I think we do need to think more creatively and imaginatively about families, and to recognize the range of relationships that people have counted as their families, forever. But we can't do that fully, under a family policing regime. So to me, it's not being a family policing abolitionist is not at all the same as wanting to uphold traditional notions of family. It's the exact opposite. And I I think that abolishing the family policing system is a necessary step, even to imagine more creatively about families, but it's also uh, a necessary step to stop the punishment of families that don't meet the heterosexist, racist family norm.
I think when people, we haven't had a lot of discussion that's been able to totally put all these different ideas around family policing abolition and what does it mean to have a liberated concept of family.
Yeah,
Again, that's why Eric was right. We need to write another book. We need to talk
yeah,
about this more. We need to have more conversation. But it's not out of the thinking or the actual impulse of
hmm,
family policing abolitionists.
hmm,
And I think it's important to kind of even trace the history of abolition, right? If we talk about abolition of chattel slavery, there was a fundamental desire to be with your family and for people to reclaim their children,
hmm,
those of which were a biological connection. That is a form of family that exists for people. That is one bracket of family.
yeah,
But I think it's okay for people to say, I want to be with this family with a child that I birth. And I think that's an okay way to resist a particular system that has taken your family and broken it up. But
yeah,
it's not the only version of family that exists.
yeah,
And what we have to understand, I think anyone who is impacted by the family policing system, communities impacted by the family police system, recognize the many ways that this reifies a nuclear colonial version of family. And Ignacio writes about this, right?
mhm,
And we think about the fact that, when I was representing parents in Bronx Family Court, if a parent said, okay, I want my neighbor to watch my kids, that was not considered kinship. That was considered a stranger.
yeah,
That stranger then taking care of the kid, quote unquote stranger, which was not a stranger to the parent, put the family on a fast track to termination of parental rights because it wasn't with the family member. So, in a place like New York, where you could even apply for kinship guardianship, which many states you cannot, that person was not considered family. And the money would not flow in the same way that it would flow with a family, insofar as that it would put them on a TPR track. And that quote unquote stranger would then be faced, if the case lasted for a certain period of time, 15 months, sometimes 6 months, depending on the type of allegations that were happening in the case, they would be forced to then legally estrange the parent and child versus having two different co-parents,
Mhm.
right? A neighbor and a parent, maybe a parent who's biologically related to that child.
Mhm.
Nothing to do with how the person I represented, the parents saw the relationship with the neighbor. It has to do with how the judge and how the system wanted to construct laws, which were really just about clearing their docket,
Mhm.
not about children, or how they wanted to address the way money and taxes were done. And so it has been years, decades. I've never experienced a time in this movement where people have not wanted a more liberated version of family.
Mhm.
I also think people want to be able to be with their children that they bring to life. I also think people want many, many iterations of that are in between and multiple caregivers. But there's one system that remains constant, which is this family policing system that says, no, we get to decide what the household is.
Mhm.
We get to take the moniker of mom and put it on a person that we decide who it is, even if your grandma, even if your neighbor, even if your friend, even if your best friend, if your lover, whatever it is you are to that person.
Mhm.
They get to decide that. And they decide it only within the concept of the nuclear form. And that actually makes us reimagine family only within that nuclear form because there's such a powerful system. So I
Mhm.
encourage anyone who's thinking about that to, read Ignacio's article. And the last question I will give to you before we wrap up, and we almost went over to 90 minutes. We could keep going. I have pages of more questions. But there's a question in the chat, Andrea, about abolitionist freedom campaigns. And so the question is, how can people, extended families, communities, learn from abolitionist freedom campaigns and assert that understanding, I would suppose, from these campaigns to support police families and actually meet the needs of families? So what can we learn from other abolitionist freedom campaigns?
I mean, everything, right? It's if it's a similar system of policing and punishment, then we can have similar responses, right? Which is to not delegate to a violent state the response, but instead to offer mutual aid that supports families, to offer transformative justice that supports families, to advocate for the kinds of redistribution of collective resources to support everyone's well-being and meet basic needs and address the root causes of harm, offer comprehensive health care, comprehensive mental health service, like everything in ways that are not about reifying these structures of power and policing, but meeting basic needs. And I think it's really asking questions at all times about, what are we trying to accomplish here, and is this actually accomplishing it? And that can be as simple as, like, why stepping into a situation and saying and interrupting criminalization in a moment of saying, why are we calling the family policing system now? What else could we do? What else could I do? What else could we do collectively? What could we transform about these conditions for these people, individual people, but also for our community as a whole? And also, how can we support self-determination and autonomy, right? I think that the thing about the family policing system is it just substitutes, if you are dealing with patriarchal power inside a traditional family that is producing violence, it's just substituting the patriarchal power of the state. So in that, the child still has no autonomy, still has no protection, still has no self-determination, still has no informed consent, still has no privacy, still has, what children don't have generally in society. And so I think family abolition is also about thinking about what kinds of structures and institutions in society perpetuate policing and violence, within and beyond the state and through the state. And so I think we can learn from that sort of analysis as we support people experiencing any kind of harm, including harm within families. And so I think the question of mutual aid, of community defense, of transformative justice, of community accountability, of transformation, repair, and reparations are all principles that apply no matter what the form of state violence or interpersonal violence or community violence that we're dealing with. And I think the challenge to abolitionist organizers is to see the family policing system, is to see the carcerality of systems that are lifted up as care, and to confront and challenge those. And so Interrupting Criminalization just hosted a convening precisely around that asks us to consider, what is a carceral space? what is a carceral practice? What is a carceral response? No matter what shape or form it takes, whether it's the medical industrial complex, the family policing system, a system of shelter and housing that is not, self-determining and reinforces policing, and to challenge and confront policing and criminalization wherever we see it and however we see it operating in our lives and communities and institutions. And that would require all of us to be family policing abolitionists and to really challenge ourselves about what it is that keeps us from taking the action we need to stop harms and forms of violence and the violence of the state as it operates on us as parents, families, and family members.
And I'm always the one that's the worst at answering this question, because I'm like, well, what do you want to do? What need do you see right now? Whoever, I love this name, Nightmare Super Sleeper. That's the person who wrote this question in, is what is happening right now that you're good at doing that also someone else needs? And that's the thing you start with doing. I think that one of the reasons that we wrote this book is because we saw people doing, we were doers, we wanted more people to do. There are 15 different articles of people who've done very different things, some which were academic things where they thought about language. Some people, like Andrew talked about interrupting criminalization. Shir Hassan writes a piece about the Transformative Justice Help Desk and creating that. Erica reminds us to change everything. People just did a lot of different stuff, right? And the reality is that we're going to need to do a lot of different stuff. And what I hope people see in this book is not what has happened, but what they can do. I hope that they read this particular book and say, you know what, I'm a little bit more like the charity article than I am the Aaron and Lisa article that started a nonprofit. Like, that's cool. Please be that, right? But if you are wanting to start an organization, we write very candidly about what was hard, difficult, and in between about that, right? And then I hope that people find all the things we missed that aren't here, because there are just so many brilliant organizers. I think about Reparations and Black Families Love and Unite with Imani, right? There's just so many people doing brilliant things. And so this is our moment to close out. It's only 6 minutes early. I wanted us to get 24 minutes earlier, but it's a great, rich conversation with people I learned a lot from. And I have just such deep gratitude. I know all the co-authors and co-editors here and contributors have a lot of gratitude to you too. We've learned so much from you. I always think about Andrea as someone who was like, can you write this thing? And I was like, I don't want to write anything, but I'm going to do it for Andrea Ritchie because I just admire her so much. And the same thing for you, Dorothy. I can't even believe that I get to call you Dorothy. It's just a beautiful thing. And we have so much gratitude for everyone who's resisting every day. And all the people who are going to organize reading circles of this book, all the people who are going to build family safety, all the people who are going to do the really hard work of interrupting violence, the stuff that we are not going to always write down to keep everyone safe. I want to uplift the powerful reminder that in these hard times, there is still work to be done that can be hopeful, that we need that now more than ever. And again, like I said, I started this conversation by saying this was a bit of a selfish endeavor at some points for me, because I really felt honored to listen and to be able to share the stories. And one of them comes from a elder mentor of mine, Reverend Annie Chambers, who is a longtime resident of East Baltimore, where I'm also from. She is over her 80s. That's what I'll give her. And she's been a Black Panther. She's was one of the original organizers for Wages for Housework. She is a beautiful human being. She is as fiery. You will see her wheeling out in the front of Palestine liberation marches in Baltimore City to this day. She's still organizing tenants for housing liberation. And she's in this piece, which is, I'm not an organizer, I just organize, with Amanda Wallace from Operation Stop CPS, Charity, Black on Both Sides, also a co-editor, Margaret Prescott, who is a just Black liberatory thinker, also Black Women for Wages for Housework and Housewives, DHS Give Us Back Our Children. And I asked her, because I felt tired, I said, Reverend Chambers, are you tired? And she said, well, we keep going by saying the words that I say all the time. I'm not tired yet. We keep going. And she told us to say it. Are they tired? No. Are they tired of abusing people? No. Are they tired of killing people?
Mm.
No. Are they tired of starving children and not educating them?
Mm.
No. So I'm not tired either. No, I'm not tired. So in the spirit of giving you at least 3 minutes back of your time, I will just say that whenever I think of the sadness and the heartbreak that we experience, I think of Annie's that she's not tired. So go out, do something. Thank you so much. It was great to see you all today.
Thanks.